Winter's advance swept across Montana's high plains with a harsh, penetrating force. The wind carried the promise of snow and the scent of pine forests, cutting through the small town of Redemption as daylight faded into shadow. Mason Garrett arrived as the sun disappeared behind distant mountains, his weathered face half hidden beneath his hat's brim, his posture weighed down by countless miles of travel and memories he wished to forget. He harbored no intention of forming friendships or creating conflict. His sole purpose was finding refuge through the cold months ahead, a luxury that men of his experience rarely achieved. He dismounted at the livery, his boots sinking into partially frozen earth. His horse, Scout the Buckskin, exhaled visible breath and tossed his head in response to the frigid air. Mason's calloused hand moved gently across the animal's neck, a gesture of tenderness that contrasted with his rough exterior. His appearance suggested a man shaped by the landscape itself, harsh, enduring, marked by hardship. The stable's interior reeked of hay and animal warmth. An elderly man with a beard like coarse rope glanced up from his tasks. Mason explained he was seeking winter lodging. The old man directed him toward Widow Eleanor's boarding house, spitting tobacco into the dirt. When Mason asked if the town was peaceful, the livery keeper's expression changed. He mentioned a bride-to-be who had abandoned a wealthy rancher named Victor Blackwood just before the ceremony. Blackwood was not someone who tolerated public humiliation. These words struck Mason like a physical blow. A runaway bride meant trouble, and troubles involving women invariably left deep wounds. He settled his bill, gathered his belongings, and ventured toward Widow Eleanor's residence through the biting wind. The boarding house matched its proprietor, unwelcoming and austere. The widow examined Mason with sharp scrutiny as she opened the door, noting his trail-worn appearance and gun. She allowed him to take a room, though her manner remained distant. His quarters were small, sparse, and freezing, but adequately maintained. From his window, he gazed down at the empty, muddy street and told himself he wanted nothing beyond a meal and whiskey to warm himself. He maintained that he cared nothing for other people's circumstances, yet fate appeared to have alternative intentions. The saloon buzzed with noise and smoke. Clusters of men congregated near a stove, their intoxicated voices rising in gossip. Mason positioned himself at the bar's far end, attempting to remain apart from the commentary. Yet certain conversation fragments reached his ears. Men discussed the runaway bride with crude dismissal, suggesting Blackwood had purchased her fairly. Their laughter triggered painful memories of his sister Rachel, whom he'd failed to protect from a violent marriage. He bore the responsibility of that failure still. The saloon doors swung open when a stagecoach arrived in town. A woman entered, drawing immediate attention from every occupant. She was younger than anticipated, with honey-colored hair that fell loosely around her face. Her refined wool dress marked her as an outsider. She clutched a small velvet bag as though it represented her entire world. Her request for a room met with deliberate facades from the bartender, who claimed all accommodations were taken. When she inquired about Widow Pritchard's establishment, the man sneered that the widow rejected unmarried women. Laughter erupted throughout the room. A trapper called out a crude proposition. Cole felt something within him shatter. He recognized his sister's fear in this stranger's expression. He watched her depart with dignity intact, and something compelled him to follow. Snow had begun descending softly. The woman stood shivering beneath the general store's awning. Mason approached gradually, removing his hat. He offered shelter in his cabin, a warm fire, food, and a bed he would surrender to her while he slept on the floor. She studied his face, searching for deception, and found none. After asking what he expected in return, he met her eyes directly. He explained simply that no one deserved to freeze in such conditions. She accepted his offer. They rode through deepening snow toward his secluded cabin. The woman, whose name was Isabella Grace, sat rigidly before him, her trust fragile and provisional. When they reached the small dwelling nestled against the forest edge, the storm had intensified dramatically. Inside, Mason tended the fire until flames danced vibrantly. He offered coffee and stew. Isabella, still wearing her damp dress, eventually moved toward the heat. Mason suggested she change into dry clothing and provided blankets for privacy. After she changed, she asked if he held her in diminished regard for abandoning her wedding. He responded that her actions demonstrated genuine courage. Morning arrived with pale light and calmer weather. Isabella awakened to find Mason had stepped outside to gather firewood. Over the following days, they established routines. Isabella managed household tasks while Mason provided for their survival. One evening, she finally disclosed her background. A preacher had raised her following her parents' death, then arranged her marriage to a wealthy, brutal man named Victor Blackwood as repayment for her upbringing. She had refused to comply. Mason listened without interrupting, then promised that anyone pursuing her would face him first. As weeks passed, the isolation intensified their connection. Lingering touches and prolonged glances suggested growing attachment. During a particularly ferocious blizzard, Isabella approached Mason by the hearth and expressed her desire to surrender her virginity to him. He secured the cabin's entrance and promised her protection and safety. The following morning brought complicated emotions. Shame that had been instilled by religious authority rose within Isabella. She feared Mason would judge her. Instead, he assured her that she had given something that belonged to her alone. Through his acceptance, her sense of shame gradually diminished. Months passed peacefully until Mason discovered a bounty poster. Blackwood had commissioned hunters to retrieve his property. Mason and Isabella fled north toward his estranged brother Thomas's ranch. Thomas refused them refuge, suggesting Mason had dragged calamity to his door once again. The rejection devastated Mason, and Isabella, believing she caused his pain, disappeared into the snow. Mason found her near collapse beneath a pine tree and held her, demanding she never leave him. He declared that he alone would determine her worth. Upon returning to the cabin, they discovered it destroyed and a threatening message burned into the wall: Blackwood's brand and a promise of reclamation. Inside Mason's coat, Isabella found a fragile letter. His sister Rachel had written it, begging Mason for rescue from an abusive marriage. He had failed her then. Isabella's discovery of this letter and subsequent kiss represented understanding and absolution. When bounty hunters attacked the cabin, Mason fought them fiercely, taking down 3 before sustaining a bullet wound. Isabella nursed him back to health through sheer determination and tenderness. Together they eventually made their way to Providence, a settlement that harbored refugees. Mason abandoned his gun and became a carpenter. Isabella supported other women escaping cruel circumstances. One spring morning beneath the endless Montana sky, a minister asked if Mason would take Isabella as his wife. Mason gazed into her eyes and replied that he already had. That evening, as stars emerged above the prairie, he secured their cabin's door and whispered his commitment to protect and love her for all their remaining nights together. Outside stretched the vast emptiness. Inside burned the flame of their hard-won devotion.